Section 5. Can qualia be deconstructed? Against this raw field view of qualia, Marvin Minsky can serve as a mainstream spokesperson to put the opposite case that qualia are simply reductive phenomena which can and should be deconstructed to non-subjective processes. Minsky says, quote, "Many philosophers have maintained that our sensations have certain basic qualities that cannot be reduced to anything else. For example, they claim that each color, like red, and each flavor, like sweet, has its own unique quality that cannot be described in terms of other things. Of course, it is not hard to make a physical instrument to measure the amount of red light that comes from the surface of some particular apple, or to measure the weight of the sugar contained in the flesh of any particular peach. However, those philosophers claim, such measures tell you nothing about the experience of seeing a redness or tasting a sweetness." And then some philosophers go on to claim, if those subjective experiences cannot be detected by physical instruments, they must exist in a separate mental world, which would mean that we cannot explain how minds work in terms of machinery inside our brains, end quote. Minsky, however, claims there's a serious flaw in that argument. He insists that if you say, "This apple looks red to me," it must be because some physical instrument in your brain must have recognized the activity involved with that experience and then caused your vocal tract to behave accordingly. He casually adds that, quote, "Our brain scientists have not yet located such circuits inside our brains, but it surely is only a matter of time before we find clusters of brain cells that recognize such combinations of conditions," end quote. In any case, Minsky continues, we already know that our perceptions are far from direct. For example, when a ray of light strikes the back of your eye, a signal will flow from each retinal cell that this excites, and those signals will then affect other resources inside your brain, and some of those resources will then construct descriptions and reports that influence yet other parts of your brain. At the same time, other streams of information will also affect those descriptions, so that when you try to describe your experience, you'll be telling a story based on sixth-hand reports. The idea that sensations are basic may have been useful in older times, but today we need to recognize the extent to which our perceptions are affected by what our other resources may want or expect. In fact, more signals flow downward from the brain's sensory cortex than in the opposite direction, presumably to help us see what we expect to see by priming us with an appropriate stimulus, end quote. Minsky continues, once we appreciate the complexity of our perceptual machinery, we can finally answer that question about why we find feelings so hard to describe. For what would a person need to be able to express their subjective feelings. Perhaps it is no accident that one meaning of the word express is to squeeze. For when you try to express yourself, your language resources will have to pick and choose among the descriptions your other resources construct, and then attempt to squeeze a few of these through your tiny channels of phrases and gestures. Of course, one can never describe one's whole state of mind, because one can focus on just a few things at a time, and because one's state is constantly changing. So usually you will simply settle for expressing those aspects whose signals seem most urgent at each moment. At one moment you're thinking about your foot, then some other sensation attracts your attention. Perhaps you notice a change in some sound, or turn your head towards something in motion, and then you notice that you are noticing these. So you can never be wholly aware of yourself, because you are a river of rivaling interests, always enmeshed in cascades of attempts to describe its ever-changing eddies and tides." End quote. But what if reductionists like Minsky and Dennett are wrong, and qualia do contain some kind of non-reducible subjective essence? Incidentally, this doesn't, as the reductionists claim, imply a dualist explanation for qualia. Their subjective essence might arise from such scientifically respectable sources as flows of energy or neurotransmitters in the brain, or from quantum phenomena. Gray speculates that in this simple energetic version, qualia, once generated, become a sort of raw material for the mind. They can be put to service in a great diversity of cognitive processes. Gray suggests that qualia, quote, can be used to construct intentional objects like roses or faces or voices, or multimodal scenes, or maps of space. They can be used to communicate complex propositions to others in speech, or to yourself in thought. They can, within limits, be attended to or ignored, remembered or forgotten. Here is where executive processes come into their own. But they do not depend upon any of these for their existence. That is why the hard problem of consciousness can be reduced to the straightforward question, how does the brain create qualia? End quote. Having boldly stated that qualia in this raw primordial form A exist and B can have a significant role in the mind, Gray then questions functionalism's attempt to reduce qualia to nothing but their functions. He describes this as trying to reduce qualia to cybernetic processes, by which he means that for functionalists, qualia are nothing more than their associated functions, where a function consists of nothing more than a set of inputs from the environment, a set of outputs back into the environment, and neural information processing that takes place between these inputs and outputs. Gray states that for functionalists, quote, a quale and its associated function are, when all the details are taken into account, identical, end quote. So functionalism's grudging acknowledgement of the existence of qualia takes this form of simply equating a quale with the information processing that takes place when a human organism carries out a biological function. For functionalism, there's no question of qualia having an energetic analog form, which may act as a causal force in rewarding or punishing particular forms of behavior. A consequence of this functionalist account of qualia is that their evolution occurs only parasitically by linkage to functions. Therefore, one would not expect to find qualia which adversely compete with the functions to which they are linked. Gray suggests that there are two different flavors of functionalism. Quote, in one flavor, qualia are reduced to so little beyond the functions with which they are linked as to be virtually eliminated. This is more or less Dan Dennett's position in his book Consciousness Explained. In the other, the separate existence of qualia is explicitly acknowledged, but all empirical data are treated as requiring explanation in terms only of the functions with which they are linked. So, as we have seen, Stephen Harnad argues that qualia are epiphenomena. They are caused by functions and their underlying mechanisms, but have no causal effects of their own. In either flavor, qualia are left with no substantive properties of their own. End quote.